Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 7th of June, where I wanted to talk more about Frankenstein. I left you off last class with watching the very iconic 1931 film Frankenstein, which I suspect most of you have never seen, but I also suspect that most of you have probably heard of that film because that film helped to create the version of Frankenstein that most people think of. And one of the more interesting things, I think, is how Hollywood has made those changes and why Hollywood has made those changes. And I asked you to consider some of those changes. For instance, the name swap between Victor and Henry. And if you think about the time period, and I believe I mentioned this in one of your discussion forum responses, that the name swap is particularly significant because of that time period where Victor would be a very German sounding name. So it wouldn't be surprising that we would have our main character's name be Henry rather than Victor in the 1931 film, just because it wouldn't have the same Germanic associations. And of course, probably the main difference between the film and the text is that people are under the impression that this is the creature's name, Frankenstein, but that's not the creature's name. In fact, in Mary Shelley's novel, the creature is never named, which goes to show how Victor Frankenstein in the novel negates all of his parental duties right from the very beginning, since Victor is the creator, because one of the first parental duties one has is to name one's child or one's creation. So Frankenstein is the name of the creator, not the creature. But of course, the 1931 film has conditioned us to think of the creature as the monster. And I'm very careful when I talk about Mary Shelley's text to talk about the creature and not to talk about the monster, because the true monstrosity, as you've seen if you've gotten a good way through the novel, isn't the creature. It's Victor Frankenstein and humanity as a whole that treats this innocent creature so horrifically. And obviously, the movie again takes liberties that there is the assumption that this creature has a diseased brain, an abnormal brain. And I encourage you to watch Mel Brooks's parody Young Frankenstein, where they talk about abnormal. But if you've seen the film, then you know exactly the reference I'm making. But nevertheless, the idea that we need to have some sort of justification for the horrific actions that the creature takes in the 1931 film, and even those horrific actions are not that horrific when we see in the film that the creature is initially tortured by Igor and or Fritz, and of course that Fritz or Igor character has become very iconic in Gothic literature and in horror film, and very much the way that many tropes become iconic. And also the idea of how this creature tries to befriend a young girl in the film and is unaware that he cannot toss the girl into the water in the way that one could toss a flower petal into the water. That this was more of a misunderstanding than a deliberate act of malice. Of course, the novel gives us a completely different story where the creature actually tries to save a drowning girl and is rewarded for his heroic activity through gunshots, again showing the bestiality and monstrosity of humanity. And I think I might have mentioned this in a previous class that monstre in Latin means to show or reveal. And the monstrosity of humanity shows or reveals some rather negative aspects of the world. And that the creature, at least in the way presented by Shelley, and even in some respects the way presented in the 1931 film, is a rather childlike innocent. And Boris Karloff, who played the role of the creature in Frankenstein, indicated that he very much wanted to play the role in that way. Tabla rasa, if you've done any work with philosophy, a kind of blank slate, which gets to the question of nature versus nurture. Is one born bad, or is one's environment responsible for one's actions, or is it some combination of the two? Which is a question that Mary Shelley grapples with as well. Obviously, the creature in Mary Shelley's novel is born as a tabla rasa, and its initial instincts are towards benevolence, to help others. And as it states rather bitterly, that it learns mischief and it learns evil through humanity. So in this instance, it would definitely be more environmental rather than genetic. But that said, with Frankenstein, one point I wanted to make out to you about the film is that the opening credits, which most people usually don't pay much attention to, begin with the fact that this is based on a novel by Mrs. Percy Shelley, which I think is particularly relevant for us in this class, since we've been talking about the idea of gender, and that even in the 1930s, even though this class is focused on the 1800s, this idea of female being absorbed by male. Remember where we talked about a Mrs. Mallard in Story of an Hour? Well, was still happening with the Mrs. Percy Shelley. Of course, the Hollywood film is going to give us the requisite happy ending, where there is going to be the destruction of the outside evil, or what seems to be the outside evil, and then a restoration of order. Of course, Mary Shelley's novel is quite different from that. And I had indicated that although our first journal is going to be due today, if you're watching this video on Tuesday the 7th, even though our course outline indicates that, I have no problem with your submitting in your journal on Thursday the 9th at 11:59 p.m. or prior to that, because I'm going to begin conversations about the Frankenstein novel today, but I'm not going to put closure to those until our next class. And my hope is that at this point you have completed the novel Frankenstein and you are in the midst of reading Persuasion. I try to start slowly at the beginning of the semester so that you can get ahead with the readings. In terms of the journal, I'm thinking about a page or so response, but it can be as long or as short as you'd like it to be, with relevant thoughts or ideas or questions that you've got about the text. Not just plot summary, but analysis and interpretation. And that I would not be evaluating for grammar or mechanics, just for content. So you could think of it as a kind of conversation on paper. And certainly you can use the information from the class videos and also the discussion forums. So the last time I checked, not everyone had the opportunity to respond to the last discussion forum question about the film and your response to the film. So if you haven't done so, please do so. And in terms of thinking about the journal, it works best for my grading program, for you to send it to my email address rather than to post it onto Moodle. So that's how you will be handing in your assignments. So rather than handing in an assignment on paper, you obviously are handing in an assignment electronically. But my electronic grading program lets me respond as if I were responding to a paper copy, as you will see when I return that back to you with your email. And because it's an informal assignment, I will be evaluating it informally on a checkmark system, with a plus being excellent, or a check plus being very good, or a check being satisfactory, which is where most of the grades range. There also is a check minus for less than satisfactory, and a minus for unsatisfactory. But again, as long as you've given some sort of an effort into talking about some of the major themes or questions presented by the novel, then really that's all I'm looking for, is that you're beginning to contemplate how that novel works as a piece of literature, and also how that novel might fit in to what our theme is this semester, which is women in literature. And in terms of reading, you want to always begin at the beginning, which for us would be the title page. There's quite a bit of information on the title page. And if you look at your title page, you'll see that Frankenstein is not the complete title, even though this is what most people call this novel, but it's Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. And this is important because ultimately this idea of Prometheus is something that's going to help us understand Mary Shelley's vision. Prometheus is from Greek mythology, and Supposedly, Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to mankind. And Prometheus is punished for his hubris or his extreme arrogance. Um, and this is something that we will see that will be very much in relation to Victor Frankenstein, who is also stealing the knowledge of gods. In this instance, is the knowledge of creating life from death. And Victor will indeed be punished for that. I hope this isn't a spoiler for you. And also, you'll see that the title page begins with a quotation. Mary Shelley was very well read. We talked a little bit about how Mary Wollstonecraft was the great feminist, Mary Shelley's mother, and that Mary Shelley had married Percy Shelley, the great romantic poet. So she had a strong literary background. And she quotes from Paradise Lost. And Paradise Lost happens to be a text written by John Milton, a very famous epic poem. And it's supposed to be about the story of the fall of man, the biblical story of Adam and Eve being tempted by Satan and the consequential expulsion from paradise or Eden into the world that we now live. And that said, it's a very subversive poem in some respects, because even though the focus should be on God and Jesus, the focus is really on Satan, the fallen angel, and how ultimately he was created by God, but then not allowed to use all of his beauty and gifts, and basically ignored by God in some respects when God created his new creature, humanity, and how Satan lashed out. And this is going to be important in terms of understanding the creature in Mary Shelley's novel. So if you haven't read Paradise Lost, at least I hope that the summary, the brief summary, albeit, that I gave you, can give you an idea of the importance of feeling as an outcast and abandoned by one's creator. And the quote that we're given at the beginning on the title page: "Did I request the maker from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me?" Which is a question that also Adam and Eve ask, as well as the fallen angel Satan asks in Paradise Lost. So that gives you an idea of some of the context of what this novel will be about before we even start reading the novel. And as I indicated, one of the great ways that Mary Shelley goes about with her narration is not by giving us a straightforward narration, but instead doing something called an epistolary novel, which you can see that I've written in the notes below. In other words, we are told the story through a series of letters. And this is a very common technique for the 1800s, but it also, I think, is a very clever technique for two purposes. The first is that this allows us to question the reliability of the narrator, because in the end, even though we get multiple stories, we have one narrator interpreting all of those stories, and that narrator is Walton, a character who is never introduced in the 1930s film, as you know, because it's not necessarily easy to translate an epistolary novel into film. It's much easier just to give a straightforward narrative. And Walton has many similarities to Victor. It's one of the reasons why Mary Shelley has created the character of Walton, so that we can see the ways that they're similar and perhaps some of the ways that they're different as well. Because both Walton and Victor want to have the knowledge of the gods. Walton talks about his ambition and his hubris and how it results in him living a very isolated and lonely life. And we see the same happen with Victor. If there's any kind of happy ending at all in Frankenstein, it's through Walton. It's not going to be through Victor. When we return to Walton's tale at the ending of the novel. And this very much is a morality tale, as is oftentimes the case with Gothic texts. I talked a little bit about the Gothic last class. It was a literary tradition that was based on an architectural term. When you think about the Gothic cathedrals, they were seen as barbaric and excessive at the time, though today they're viewed as quite beautiful. And also the Germanic Goths, who were a conquering and invading tribe. And both of these were seen as barbaric to help explain the Gothic tradition, which was a literary form of writing where female would be under siege and her virtue would be threatened by an external force, and oftentimes there would be a hero that would save her. There would be lots of darkness, lots of mystery, lots of atmosphere, and at the ending, there would be the possibility of supernatural elements, but they would be ambiguous enough so that they could be explained through natural causes. So keep that in mind as we're reading Frankenstein, because Frankenstein does fit into the Gothic tradition as well as fits into the science fiction tradition, something that could be explained through science, though our science might not have necessarily gotten to the point of being able to create that explanation, as opposed to the supernatural, something which defies the natural order and could never be achieved through science. But this epistolary novel technique is very easy to forget once we go through the initial set of letters, because we get Victor's story told in the I, as if Victor himself were talking himself, but he's not talking directly to us. Keep in mind, this is Walton's translation. And Walton is not a terrifically reliable narrator, in the sense that Walton is basically facing a mutinous crew. He's gone for long periods of time without companionship, without proper nutrition, without proper rest. So all of that leads to the question of how accurate can Walton's tale be, which leads to a certain level of ambiguity, going back to the idea of the Gothic, if we don't necessarily want to accept any possible supernatural elements that could be referenced in this particular text. That said, even if we could completely rely on Walton's narrative, and keep in mind that Walton is also writing all of this down at the ending of the day after Victor tells him. Think about how difficult it would be to transcribe something like a college lecture at the ending of the day when you were no longer present, let alone a story as complex as Victor's with all of the physical and emotional challenges that Walton is facing. But assuming that Walton is giving us an accurate portrayal, we don't necessarily know if Victor is giving us an accurate portrayal, because he too, we see as the story progresses, is suffering under great physical and mental duress. And keep in mind that we never hear directly from the creature. We hear Victor's tale from the creature until we get to the ending of the novel, where it seems as if Walton and the creature have a conversation. But again, we have to question as to whether or not we can completely rely on Walton's narrative. But our central characters are male, and that leads to some questions for a women in literature class. We've got Walton, we've got Victor, and we've got the creature, and all of them are male. But we see how all of their lives basically are filled with dissent and with negatives, because female has been excluded from their lives. We see this initially with Walton when he's reaching out to his sister. One would assume that he had kept that female presence in his life, and if he hadn't gone off on his own for his ambition, he would be in a much better place. We'll see the same with Victor when he is able to spend time with Elizabeth and have a union with her, but instead disregards that and excludes her from his life, and we see the negative consequences that result because of that. Even the creature, notice that with the creature's demand, one that we could certainly empathize with, and we'll talk about some more next class, that the creature wants a companion created for him so that he isn't completely isolated and alone. He wants a female. And again, thinking about Paradise Lost, this sounds very similar to the creation of Adam and Eve, if you are familiar with the biblical story. But think about the creature's request, or demand. Certainly, while we can understand why the creature would want companionship, the creature wants a female created solely for his own pleasure, without asking about how that might influence the female. And so that too, I think, is part of the narrative that Mary Shelley is giving us about this male-centric world that excludes female or views female as being present merely for the satisfaction of the male figure. And in that way, I think we have a feminist commentary. And in another way, I think we have a feminist commentary is that we have lots of long descriptions about nature and the natural world. I had talked a little bit about Mary Shelley getting advice from her husband, Percy Shelley, to expand her narrative. And it does seem that at times the novel drags on a bit, and I think much of that has to do with these long descriptions of nature and the natural world, which was a romantic element during the time period. The Romantic poets were known for celebrating nature and the natural world and drawing parallels with our own world, our human world. But nature is usually viewed as feminine. And think about when Victor is in the natural world, he is in a much better place than when he isolates himself in his laboratory. And this sense of female as nature is something that we're going to be seeing also in other texts, such as Jane Eyre. But considering the amount of time that's spent with discussing the beauties of the natural world, we could argue that the feminine nature is a central character in the text. We have other female characters. Elizabeth, who is adopted into the family and is viewed as a potential mate for Victor. And they talk of each other almost as brother and sister, but remember, they're not blood related, so it wouldn't have been that unusual for the idea that these family members would unite. It's something we will talk about with our next text, Persuasion, that if you are from a certain class, then the assumption is that you have a very limited number of options in terms of your mate, because you wanted to marry somebody who was equal or somebody who was higher up in social status. So certainly you didn't want to marry down. And Elizabeth, I think that her description is quite interesting, that even though she's adopted into the family, she has European features. That's one of the reasons why she's adopted into the family, while her other while her companions are not as European, and they're viewed as savage. So there's a certain amount of racism and Eurocentrism, I think, that is indicated in the text. So as progressive as Mary Shelley might have been in terms of gender, she also was a product of her time. It's something to keep in mind with Persuasion as well, in that while we may not necessarily seem to have a particularly strong female character leading our story, we do have a female character leading our story. And that way is perhaps more progressive than what we see with Frankenstein. And then again, authors are basically products of their time. So what might have been progressive for that time might not necessarily seem progressive in our own time period. But by the time we get to the ending of the semester and we get to Kate Chopin and The Awakening, we definitely will see female characters who break against the stereotypes of their time period. Something else to note about Elizabeth is that she's motherless, and not that I had planned it this way, but we'll see that in all of the major texts that we are reading this semester, we are going to be reading about motherless characters. Victor, too, laments the loss of his mother, and this is one of the ways that perhaps we can explain Victor's motivation for trying to defy nature, because of the loss that he's experienced with the death of his mother, that ultimately he wants to create life from death. There are occult references in this text, so we will talk about that in the relation to the Gothic. Things like the Philosopher's Stone or Cornelius Agrippa. If you're familiar with Harry Potter, you might be familiar with the Philosopher's Stone or with the Sorcerer's Stone, which is supposed to give everlasting life. And Cornelius Agrippa was a great occultist. So when Victor is talking about these elements, it's more than just science. He is also talking about the occult, which would lead to possibilities of the supernatural and the Gothic. But of course, there are lots of science elements associated with this text. And I think Mary Shelley was very clever in that the great creation scene, which doesn't come until much later in the novel, she doesn't give too many details about how to create life from death. And in fact, when Walton asked Victor for details, he declines to give them. And I think this gives Mary Shelley's novel a certain timelessness associated with it, because if she had given details, my suspicion is that science would have questioned some of those details in later times. So by being very general, I think it allows her text to have a certain level of believability even generations later. And the overview that I wanted to talk about in terms of the letters, letter one is written to a Mrs. Seville in England. Again, notice the reference to Mrs., and she's not given her first name. And we've talked about how oftentimes that was used to remove individual identity from female. And the scene is very gothic. We know that Walton is basically in a place of frost and desolation and cold and isolation. Isolation is very much an element of the Gothic. And in my version on page 2, in that first letter, he talks about his hubris, his ambition to his sister in his letter, that you cannot contest the inestimable benefit by which I shall confer on all mankind, to the last generation, by discovering a passage near the pole to those countries, to reach which at present so many months are required, or by ascertaining the secret of the magnet, which, if at all possible, can only be effected by an undertaking such as mine. It also is something that Victor claims, that his discovery of creating life from death can help humanity. There is a reference to another literary text, although not included in the opening page, that Mary Shelley would have been quite aware of. A Dr. Faustus, which was a Renaissance drama that was written around the time of Shakespeare. And the story of Dr. Faustus is about a man, Dr. Faustus, who has basically limitless knowledge, and he becomes bored with the knowledge of law and medicine and theology. So he makes a deal with the devil so that he can have the knowledge of that which is not granted to humanity. And as you can probably guess, this is also a morality tale. It's never a good idea to make a deal with the devil. And the deal with the devil is that eventually, after Faustus has enough time to enjoy the fruits of his supernatural knowledge, that the devil will collect by taking Faustus's soul. And Faustus rationalizes all of this, and that he's going to be able to use this knowledge for the good of humanity. In other words, he can cure disease, for instance, and bring about everlasting life. And the irony we see is that throughout the play, Faustus doesn't spend his time at all doing that. He spends his time squandering his knowledge. For instance, he makes himself invisible so that he can play pranks on church officials when they are giving church services. And throughout the play, Faustus keeps rationalizing that either he has enough time to repent so that he may as well enjoy himself now and he can repent later, or his sins are so egregious that even God couldn't forgive him, so he may as well enjoy himself now. And in the human world, because he's going to be eternally damned. And then at the very ending of the play, after Faustus has completely squandered his knowledge, he tries to repent, but it's too little too late, and he's taken kicking and screaming into hell. And keep this idea of Dr. Faustus in mind when we're talking about people like Walton, and more particularly when we're talking about people like Victor Frankenstein, who want the knowledge that perhaps is forbidden to humanity and the consequences of that. But in the first letter, Walton says that he prefers glory to any enticement that wealth could be put in his place. And that also is true of Victor, as we find out about Victor. In the second letter, Walton admits he has no friend. That's one of the costs for pursuing this kind of limitless knowledge. I have no friend, Margaret, when I am glowing with enthusiasm of success, and there will be none to anticipate my joy. So in other words, this is the cost, the solitude that results. And as I had indicated in the Gothic, usually one of the main messages is that one needs to embrace community for survival. And once one engages in solitude or isolation, this is when one becomes vulnerable to monstrosity. So Victor, too, talks about how lonely and isolated he is as the novel progresses, especially as he abandons his best friend and he abandons his fiancée so that he can pursue unlimitless knowledge and then of course deal with the consequences of that. Part of Victor's sin is trying to create life from death. The other part is the negation of his responsibility once he's created that life, where Victor becomes basically a kind of absent and negligent parent. And then we here in letter 3, again, as Walton is continuing to lament to his sister, success shall crown my endeavors, wherefore not? Thus far I've gone, tracing a secure way over the pathless seas, the very stars themselves being witness and testimonies of my triumph. Why not still proceed over the untamed yet obedient element? What can stop the determined heart and resolved will of man? And of course, we'll see that there are things that can stop the determined heart and resolved will of man. In letter 4 is when Walton talks about coming across Victor and that he didn't seem to be a, quote, savage inhabitant of some undiscovered island, but was a European. It's one of the reasons why Walton says that he can't necessarily have companionship on the ship because the others are beneath them, not just in terms of status and in class, but also in terms of just their heritage as well. And we see that with his comment with something like Victor and not being a savage inhabitant from some undiscovered island. Which again we will see with Elizabeth as well when Victor tells his tale about why it was that his parents adopted Elizabeth. And notice how she's referred to basically her physical appearance, and that the parents and Victor assume that she's going to be basically the wife of Victor, the prize given to Victor. Again, when we think about the cult of true womanhood and the role of female to go from father to husband, and how she's seen as a kind of entity or prize, much like the creature thinks of a female being created for him as a kind of entity or prize, or at least compensation. And in letter 4, Walton starts to talk to Victor, and as they begin to discuss the idea of being a slave to passion, keep that in mind about how someone's passion or ambition can consign them to a kind of slavery, if you will. And there's a Christian analogy. This is very much a Christian text. We definitely see Christian analogies with things like Paradise Lost, but the idea in the very last letter from August 19th, that yesterday the stranger said to me, you may easily perceive, Captain Walton, I've suffered great and unparalleled misfortunes. I've determined that at one time that the memory of these evils should die with me, but you've won with me to alter my determination. You seek for knowledge and wisdom as I once did, and I ardently hope that the gratification of your wishes may not be a serpent to sting you. Again, if you know the story of Adam and Eve, Satan appeared as a serpent, as mine has been. I do not know that the relation of my disasters will be useful to you. And he talks about that he hopes that ultimately Walton will learn from Victor's mistakes. And this is where we get into chapter 1, where we hear Victor's story told in the eye. But again, don't forget that this is a translation from, or a transcription from Walton. Oh, sorry about that. From Walton that is done after hours. And of course, Walton is a very poor physical and emotional shape as well. So I hope that gives you an idea of some of what we will be finishing talking about when we talk about Frankenstein next class. For today's attendance question, which would be due Thursday on the 9th at 9 a.m., I wanted to ask you about that epistolary novel technique. Did you like or dislike Shelley's use of the epistolary novel technique, and why? Again, note that there is no right or wrong answer. I'm more interested in the thinking behind your answer than the answer itself. And as I indicated, you're not required to respond to your peers, though I certainly encourage you to, much like you would do if you were in a class. But I do ask that you read all of your peers' responses, and you would have noted that I respond to all of your responses. So you should read my response to everybody as well, to give you an idea of what it is that we would have talked about in class if we were actually meeting in person. So what I wanted to do next class was to put some closure to Frankenstein. So we are approximately a half a class behind, if you're curious, which is why I am giving you an extension on the journal if you'd like to take it until Thursday. And then we can begin talking about persuasion. And as I indicated at the top of the class, my hope is that you've already begun persuasion. And hopefully, ideally, by this Thursday, you would have finished persuasion, though certainly you have the weekend because we will be talking about persuasion also the following week. And I must admit that persuasion can be a very dry novel. It's about wealth and privilege. So we get a lens into a very different kind of society. Certainly, Victor comes from a certain level of wealth and privilege, but we see the importance of status in persuasion when we see the Elliot family and the particular concerns of the daughters and whom they shall marry, which is sort of hinted at with something like Elizabeth in Frankenstein, but not really detailed in much depth. And we are given a central female character, so in that way it's a progressive novel, but in other ways it's very indicative of its time and its place. I can admit to you that it's probably the novel that I have the least amount of connection with because I personally don't come from a background of wealth and privilege. There used to be a television show in the 1980s that was called The Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, where you could look behind the scenes, so to speak, and get an idea of how individuals with wealth and status would live. Of course, that would be doctored somewhat for the needs of television. As I indicated to you, I do teach media and popular culture classes, so I am interested in media and popular culture. But once we get into persuasion, I think you'll see that we get a glimpse into the lifestyles of the rich and famous, so to speak, or if not rich, at least the very well-to-do, and those that have a certain level of social status. And keep in mind that this is a British culture, not an American culture, and that it wouldn't necessarily be doctored for the demands of something like television. So it's meant to be quite critical of this class and station through our narrator, Anne Elliot. So keep that in mind, that Anne is very much an outsider and very progressive for her time, considering the family and the lifestyle that she is embedded with. So hopefully that'll make the reading a little bit more accessible. But we will be seeing lots of different classes and social classes, that is, throughout the course of the semester. Once we get to Jane Eyre, we'll talk about how Jane Eyre is not from that world of class and privilege. And then once we get to Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, we'll talk about that in the context of all of this happening, we have slavery. And not just the degradation of slavery, and there are slave narratives from the time, but to have a slave narrative told from a female perspective. So now you've got a double element of repression and suppression, not just because of one's skin color, but because of one's gender as well. So again, for our attendance question for the 9th at 9 a.m., but if you need additional time, please ask. Did you like or dislike Shelley's use of the epistolary novel technique, and why? And I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on and discuss Frankenstein and then begin with persuasion. Take care. Bye-bye.